I try to imagine a fellow smarter than myself, and then I try to think, what would he do?
Charge up your axons, ready your receptors, and shift your lobes into upper beta phase. You are listening to Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast dedicated to helping you optimize your brain with the latest breakthroughs in neuroscience, nootropics, and psychopharmacology.
Hello and welcome to Smart Drug Smarts. I am your host, Jesse Lawler, excited to bring you the 109th episode of this podcast, and the very first episode of 2016. This is actually going to be published on New Year's Day, in what will actually be our 5th calendar year, if I count correctly, although the podcast is just over 3 years old, and very, very excited for the new year, as I hope you are also. Given that it's kind of the thing that people do around this time of year, we are going to be talking about habits, which tie into New Year's resolutions and things that we'd like to change about ourselves for the better, hopefully, in the new year. We're going to be talking with Jen Lebrecht, who's a Los Angeles-based scientist who's making a career out of studying habit, sloughing off bad habits, forming up good ones, and how that can most easily be done, most quickly be done, or most good habits established in parallel with one another if you got a whole lot of changes you want to make at once. If you hang around until the very end of the episode, in the ruthless listener retention gimmick, I'm going to tell you the number one thing that I'm going to be doing in the next let's say 2 weeks to try to improve my own intelligence. This is sort of it's an ongoing strategy, but it's something that I'm actually going to be making a hard push at in the very immediate future. And no, in case you're wondering, it does not involve any smart drugs, any compounds of any kind, nothing orally ingested or otherwise taken into the body. But beyond that, I will keep you guessing. You'll just have to wait, because as usual, we are kicking things off with This Week in Neuroscience.
Smart Drug Smarts, This Week in Neuroscience.
So everybody likes sleep. Sleep is fun. Few of us are ready when the alarm clock goes off in the morning, and yet it's something that we don't make enough time for. Neurologically, one of the big benefits of sleep, among others, is that it's understood to be the time when we move things out of shorter-term memory storage and consolidate them into long-term memories. But according to at least one new study, sleep per se might not be necessary for long-term memory consolidation. Even taking time to zone out and doing nothing and just being kind of mentally calm and at rest for about 10 minutes can boost people's abilities to remember new information. Researcher Michaela Dewar at Heriot-Watt University in Edinburgh in the UK has shown that regular people who had a 10-minute rest after hearing a story remembered 10% more of that story a week later than those who had played a mentally active game immediately after hearing the story. Similar studies at the same university have also shown that we can consolidate spatial memories when we rest without sleeping. The effect is apparently particularly strong with people with amnesia. Amnesiacs who were given the ability to rest for 9 minutes and do nothing were able to remember between 30 and 80% of the list of words that was given to them, compared to without a break, 8 of the 12 study participants were literally unable to remember anything from the list. So 8 of the 12 had 0%. That went up to a range of 30 to 80% when people were given 9 minutes of rest. Says Dewar, the findings challenge the current theories of memory. It's typically assumed that people with amnesia lose the ability to consolidate memories. They can take in information, but it's rapidly gone. But if we try to reduce the amount of information going in, then people with amnesia can form new memories. There's some spare capacity there that we can tap into. For those of us without amnesia, this is still a nice finding, knowing that even if you might not be getting enough sleep at night, even if you can't necessarily find a convenient place to actually fall asleep during the day, just taking a nice little mental time out, sort of zoning out for 10 minutes, might have some legitimate cognitive benefits. But the scientists stress that this really does need to be full downtime. Dimly lit room, mind wandering, doing nothing.
Smart Drug Smarts, we get you thinking.
So we just came out of a holiday week. I guess we're still in a holiday week, actually, clinging on to the tail end of it. But from my highly biased viewpoint, it really seemed like 2015 was just a major banner breakthrough year as far as public interest and a lot of the topics that we're talking about here. Everything from cognitive enhancement, transhumanism, artificial intelligence, amplified intelligence, and a lot of these ideas really kind of seeing the light of day in a much broader way than it seems like they have in the past. There's that saying, there's nothing stronger than an idea whose time has come. And I kind of feel like this general trend of people getting more clued into what's going on with their brain, that's going to be sort of an ongoing uptrend. I think that we're kind of in a positive feedback loop with a lot of the science that's available now. If you want to keep apprised of some of the things that I'm reading in neuroscience and related fields, as well as everything that we've got going on within Smart Drug Smarts, I warmly invite you to sign up for our newsletter, which is a quick and painless process. You can easily sign up over at smartdrugsmarts.com/newsletter. We'll send you about an email a week. It's there for a quick scan to read and get jazzed up about all the possibilities going on with brain science. And I want to thank everybody that's reached out over the course of the past week. People have time off work, so they're rampantly tweeting and texting and emailing and Facebooking and all those things. Would also like to thank all the first-time first-time buyers over the course of the past month over at axonlabs.io, people that have tried Nexus or mitogen for the first time. We've got those couple of stacks that we introduced in summer of last year. A lot of people trying those out for the Christmas season. I'm not sure if that's people buying it for themselves necessarily or giving it to friends and loved ones for the holidays, but either way, happy to see that circulating out there. When you've got feedback, definitely drop us an email. Really happy to hear about the results people are getting. I got one holiday email from Ari Mizell over at lessdoing.com, who got a bunch of Nexus and mitogen for his virtual assistants, and he said, "Hey, the VAs are bonkers for Nexus and mitogen. Thank you so much." I suspect that means that they were having good results. We'll be doing a little annual wrap-up post about 2015 sometime in the next week. But one thing I know, even without having the stats to prove it, is that probably about 50% of our episodes last year ultimately came to us by way of listener recommendations, like, hey, you should talk with this person, hey, you should check out this article. That stuff is hugely helpful. Want to really continue to encourage people to send us those ideas. We've got a contact page at the smartdrugsmarts.com website. My email address is jesse@smartdrugsmarts.com, and we'd love to hear from you.
Smart Drug Smarts.
So we are going to be talking with Jen Lebrecht. She is a postdoctoral research associate at the University of Southern California, and she is making a habit of studying habit. Her dissertation was Habits as Friend and Foe to Self-Control, the Dual Roles of Routinized Behavior. She's moved on to several other topics of study, but all of them are based around the power and peril of habituated behaviors in our lives. If you're like me, you're looking for these moments of peak performance and reaching that flow state, or maybe having the light bulb going on, aha moment. Those are the really exciting moments, the things that get the fanfare, and are sort of the iconized pictures of what accomplishment looks like if you did a freeze frame. But really, the day in, day out trudge of habit is ultimately sort of what defines us. And of course, having the right habits can make those breakthrough moments much more likely to occur. There's that poem that you probably have heard. It's one of these things that like hangs on dentists' office ceilings in front of a picture of a waterfall or a lotus flower. It says, "Be careful of your thoughts, for your thoughts become your words. Be careful of your words, for your words become your actions. Be careful of your actions, because your actions become your habits. Be careful of your habits, because your habits become your character. And be careful of your character, because your character becomes your destiny." So yeah, habits makes line 3 out of 5 in that "where your destiny comes from" poem. And I can't disagree with that. It is a very, very important topic. So let's dive in with Dr. Jen Lebrecht.
So I started out as a cognitive psychologist, and I was really interested in some of the methodologies that they were using in the habit lab, some of the reaction time measures, and the ways they were really interested in studying kind of the cognitive mechanisms behind the habits that we have, because everyone's interested, I think, intrinsically in how we form habits and kind of how we break our bad habits. We all seem to have them. I know I was a nail biter for years. And so I was interested in kind of better understanding at the very basic level some of the mechanisms that were driving my own habits and then how to shape other people's habits as well.
Definition-wise, is everybody's sort of intuitive definition of habit more or less correct? Or when you guys are talking about it scientifically, is there something more to habit than meets the eye from the normal user perspective?
So that's a great question too, because I think a lot of people assume, oh, we kind of colloquially talk about habits and everyone knows what we're talking about. And we kind of all do, things that we do persistently, but a lot of people associate that with bad habits. But we've done a lot of research lately on good habits and how you can use good habits to shape your behavior as well. But among the scientists who study habits, there was actually a paper just released last year about the many, just myriad of definitions that we have just among our small group of researchers of habits for the habit construct. So there's a lot of disagreement about what habits actually are, even among the scientists who are studying them.
Oh no, that makes it hard because that means you're not all studying the same thing.
It does make it really hard. And so we're actually working now kind of as a group, trying to work together, get a better sense of exactly what we're trying to study. And it's really important that we're all kind of looking at the same thing. So this great researcher, Ben Gardner out of the UK, put together a really interesting paper looking at the definitional aspects of habit and kind of what it can be and what it can't be, right? So a lot of people, when they're referring to habits, are kind of referring to them as the outcome of a process. You can't talk about habit as both the process and the outcome of the process.
Right. So like the outcome would be I have bad breath, but the habit might be I don't brush my teeth enough.
Exactly. Yeah. And people talk about it both ways. So we have to work really hard about making that definition more concrete. And so I think he's done a really nice job at trying to isolate that we're actually looking at a process when we're talking about habits. This is a cognitive process where we're linking contextual cues in our environment to a behavioral response. And over time, when we repeat behaviors consistently, linking them over and over to these contextual cues, we form these associations in procedural memory. And eventually, just simply encountering these cues brings this association to mind. And he considers habit as kind of an impulse. So when you get this impulse, it's not something that you absolutely have to do. You can stop yourself from biting your nails if it's a bad habit, but it's kind of your default. It's an impulse. It's what you're likely to do unless you actively stop yourself.
What's harder? Is it generally considered to be harder to quit a bad habit or to form a new good habit?
Fortunately, it's much easier to form a new good habit than it is to quit a bad habit in most cases. So, forming a habit, there are lots of great strategies that you can use. There's some planning strategies. Some very effective ones are called implementation intentions. They're if then plans. So, if X, then Y, and you stipulate when, where, and how you're going to perform an action. And it helps you to kind of turn a goal state into a concrete behavioral state. So implementation intentions can be really helpful for things like I want to eat more fruits and vegetables in the new year. So if I'm putting my dinner plate together, then I'm going to make sure that half of the plate is fruits and vegetables. Right? These are really easy things to do, and they tend to be very effective. Breaking a bad habit is a little bit more complicated. It's really hard just to straight up stop doing something. Just preventing yourself from doing something in itself can be really difficult. So sometimes people have difficulty breaking habits like snacking when they get home from work. And it's difficult to just stop a habit like that, to just put the brakes on something that you're already doing consistently. So, one thing that you can do instead of trying to just stop something that's a bad habit is try substituting a positive behavior for a negative behavior. And that's one option. So instead of when you get home from work, if you tend to snack on junk food like chips, instead of trying to just stop cold turkey doing that behavior, which may be very effortful, you can try substituting a good behavior for a bad behavior. Like when you go to grab your bag of chips, instead, take an apple. That can be more effective than trying to perform the really effortful action of stopping a habit that's already very well established.
Can we use what we know about neurotransmitters and our brains to really affect the likelihood that a good habit will stick or that we'll be able to cut out a bad one?
There's, I'm sure, some work about neurotransmitters in addiction because addictions are very physiologically linked. And I actually don't study a lot of the addiction literature because I come from more of a straight behavioral habit background. But habits are a very important part of addiction. And so I'm sure that they do have a physiological component, and very much including brain chemistry. And they're very much linked to basal ganglia activation. So as you form your new habit associations, there are kind of two loops that are involved, right? There's an associative loop, which is in the prefrontal cortex. And that is related to kind of goal directed action. And then there's a sensory motor loop, which maps onto the posterior putamen, and that supports these context behavior links that are important for habits. And what we see is people transition from the more associative loop to the more sensory motor loop, kind of as habits are being established.
One of the things that I've read quite a bit about in the last couple of years, and I think this has sort of been an idea that's out there, is the idea of willpower as a depletable resource. And I think that there's been somewhat of a back and forth in studies on whether that's the right way to think about it or not. Has science come down firmly one way or another on the idea of willpower being something that drains out of us over the course of a day?
Boy, I wish it would. I think that this is one of the most fascinating ideas in science. And in fact, this is one of the things that got me really excited about habits and has kept me excited about habits. And I used this in my dissertation work. I was really excited to see whether habits could be crucial for increasing or at least maintaining people's self control. Because we know that when you're performing habits, you don't need to exert additional self control, right? Because habits are performed automatically. So I thought that using habits can be a way to maintain self control over time. I thought it was a really interesting idea and I was excited to explore it. Unfortunately, it's really difficult to test these ideas about willpower or depletion, as you mentioned, what we call it when you have exerted willpower over time. And so I had a lot of difficulty depleting individuals, getting them to exert their willpower kind of on command. That was a problem for me in my dissertation work. And just after I finished working on my dissertation, a meta analysis came out looking across a number of studies at the overall depletion effects and showing that I was not alone. Some labs find very strong depletion effects with their manipulations, and other labs just can't find them, just like I had the same difficulty. So it's not only unclear whether or not willpower is a depletable resource in general, it's really unclear how you would do it if it's possible to deplete it. Seems like it has some very specific conditions. And part of that may be that we're doing this work in the lab, and it's just not the way that people exert self control in real life. There's a big difference between when we ask people in a typical lab experiment, we'll ask people to do something like a visual attention task where they're not supposed to read words that are moving across the screen or even just in a single place on the screen. They're just simply not supposed to read the word, which is very different from being on your 10th day of a diet and someone puts a donut in front of you. Like that is just a very different experience in terms of exerting willpower. So I think that we have a lot to learn kind of in terms of the real world experience of willpower. But I still think that there's so much that we have left to figure out about this. And yeah, the case is definitely not closed on this one for sure.
Let's tie that into New Year's resolutions and goals and things like that, because when we think about goals and resolutions, they seem almost at first like it's the same thing. Like, of course, a resolution is going to be some sort of goal that I'm trying to achieve. But are these always synonymous? Can somebody kind of think conceptually at a high level that they have a goal, but maybe subconsciously they haven't really bought into it yet and maybe be undercutting themselves?
Oh, yeah, that's an interesting way to think about it for sure. I think oftentimes people think about resolutions and they think about them in very big ways, just as you're suggesting, kind of very abstract ways. Sometimes we call this construal. You can have a high level construal and think about things very abstractly, or a low level construal and think about things very concretely. And the problem with a high level construal is you may not make those really specific steps that you need to actually get something done. And you may not anticipate the roadblocks that are involved in getting it done. And so that's where things like implementation intentions and other kind of goal planning procedures may be helpful in trying to figure out what the actual steps are and perhaps even sub goals are for your goals, breaking down your goals. Now, once you've established goals, one of the best ways to maintain long term behavior is to form proactive habits, positive habits for good behavior that you would like to maintain. But the great thing is that once you've established strong habits, once you've repeated a behavior consistently in a stable context, it's important that the context is stable for a long enough time, those goals become irrelevant. So even if you're not super motivated, even if you're tired, if you're going through a stressful time, if it's finals, that becomes irrelevant because you've formed this kind of default program of performing this behavior that's good for you, which is fantastic. So, in terms of New Year's resolutions, a lot of people drop off over time because this was entirely motivationally run. And when they lose the motivation, they no longer have the willpower or whatever it is to perform the behavior. But if they can start doing something consistently each day or a certain number of days each week, and they can do it in the same way and actually form habits for the behavior, they should be able to maintain it in the long term with a much greater likelihood.
That kind of brings me to the question you were talking about complex tasks and how people sometimes run into problems if they don't break those down into the component steps. How does the complexity of a behavior relate to building a habit around it? Like, let me put this in a clearer way. If my overall goal is to write a book, but that's going to involve researching my topic, and then let's say there's a bunch of individual sub goals to that. Is there a way for me to habituate that entire process effectively? Like, say, I'm going to spend 1 hour a day in a particular location working on the book, although the things that I might be doing in the course of that 1 hour might be wildly different from one day to the next, doing research versus learning how to type versus editing the book. Is there a way for sort of abstract habits like that to still be made effectively?
Yeah, because there's a difference between initiation of a behavior. You can do that habitually. You can initiate a behavior habitually versus maintaining the whole length of the behavior. We talk a lot about habits like going to the gym. And so oftentimes when I think about going to the gym, I think that there's a habitual initiation. Whatever it is that gets you to the gym, you're doing habitually. Now, once you get to the gym, you may not do the same thing in the same order every single time. You may actually make decisions once you get to the gym, and that's probably fine. But the fact is, you're there, and so you're probably going to keep working out. You're not going to get to the gym and go, I feel like going home now. Once you're there, you're probably fine, and you're probably going to do your workout. The key is getting you there, and that's why you need the habit to actually get you there. So if you can establish a habit to get to the gym, once you get to the gym, you're probably okay. And I think your suggestion is a great one. If you can establish a habit to get to a place where you're sitting down in a work environment and you have an hour and you know that this is your constraint, then you're probably going to work because everything is set up to do that for you. So the key is getting you to that environment and making it easy once you're there to actually do your work. That is part of it too, having anticipated any roadblocks. So if you get there and you don't have the pens you need, or it's noisy, or you can't get in, then those things are going to be a problem. But if you don't have any roadblocks like that, just getting there is going to be half the battle for sure.
For things that could be like environmental clues or sort of priming effects, like I always listen to this music when I do this activity, or I'm always in this physical location when I do this activity, there's probably a handful of those things that you could use to your advantage. Do we have a sense from studies as to whether one modality might be more effective than another?
That's super interesting. I don't know of any studies that have pitted multiple different contextual cues against each other, but I know many studies rely on physical location as context because it's very consistent and people use it often. And oftentimes that naturally pairs, it just happens to naturally pair with time of day. So oftentimes people will do things in the morning in their bathroom, for example. That's like a flossing studies have that frequently, or teeth brushing studies. So that's a good place to get people to do things as part of their morning routine. But another thing that we've been using very fruitfully is using previous actions in a sequence. So if you do things in the same order as part of a morning routine, morning is often a place that you do things very stably over time. If you do things in the same order as part of a morning routine or any routine, and you can insert something into that sequence, you'll be much more likely to continue doing that because you've inserted it into an already established sequence of habits. And you can use the previous action as a cue, which is this very stable cue for you to perform that new behavior. So we've used this for things like inserting new ingredients in a recipe, for example, in a well-learned recipe. And that works very well. So if you, for example, want to start flossing and you brush your teeth every morning, then perhaps you can put the floss next to your toothbrush and plan to floss immediately after you brush your teeth because you know that you're going to be brushing your teeth at that time. So it would make sense to have it be the next step in your sequence.
When people are trying to acquire new good habits or maybe cut out bad habits, as you mentioned, replacing a positive habit with a negative one, is that something that is best done sequentially? I mean, is it within our capacity to develop multiple new good habits at once? Is it better to daisy chain these things out, wait until one is established before we move on to the next one?
I think oftentimes people get really excited and they get a lot of motivation, especially at the beginning of the year, and they try to do a lot of things at once. And I think it's important to remember that until habits are established, each time you're trying to do something new, it does take effort. So when you try to tackle too many things at one time, you're really exerting a lot of effort and you have to use your memory to remember to do each of these things each time. And every time you forget to do them, you're less likely to be forming habits, right? Because you're not performing a behavior consistently over time. So my suggestion would be just do try to take one at a time, right? Try to make one change at a time. And once you've firmly established a new habit, then you can kind of move on to the next thing because then you won't have to be exerting any effort to perform that habit. It will be your default state and you can use all of your effort and attention to try to start performing the new behavior and forming the new habit.
It's famously been said that it takes 3 weeks to establish a new habit. I don't know whether that's true, false, or I guess what I'm wondering about is, does the repetition of the behavior, if it's something that's more than daily or less than daily, does that have any bearing on how long it takes to get something established?
So first, let me just say that the 3 weeks comes from an old study that really wasn't looking at habit formation at all and has been entirely discredited.
Okay, let's pop that bubble.
Yeah, so we know now that it's not 3 weeks. And there's a great study, I believe it was 2010, by a researcher, Pippa Lally, and some of her colleagues that has been really well cited now. It's in the area of exercise psychology. And they looked at for health habits, specifically exercise habits for the most part, how long does it take for people to form new habits? They're very interested in this question and they track the trajectory for a number of people. And I think they found on average it was 66 days to form a new habit. And the range at the low end, it was 21 days. The high end, it was hundreds of days. So it greatly depended on the complexity of the behavior, like you've mentioned before. So very simple behaviors can form habits much more quickly than very complex behaviors. And also the individual. Some people form habits much more quickly than other people. And especially we find that in people who have developed strategies to form habits because they're lower in self-regulatory resources. So in senior individuals who are losing some of their capacity for things like working memory, it may be beneficial for them to form habits as an adaptive strategy instead of trying to manage in real time all of the needs of their goals to perform all of their behaviors. So they can form habits, then that way they don't have to exert effort to maintain goals in mind at all times. So it's very helpful for people like that. And then other people are just very busy. We found that habit performance is associated with successful self-regulation. So people who self-regulate well just happen to form habits in general, in many cases. So some people think if I do it more, I'll form a stronger habit. And that can be true. So if you do something more, you're more likely to form a habit than if you do it not often at all. But the key is doing it more in a stable context. So if I perform a behavior, but I do it just all over the place, regardless of context, I'm less likely to form a habit than if I do it moderately often in a very stable context. And we found that people can form habits for things that you wouldn't think of as performed frequently, but they do it every single time that they're in that context. So, one of my favorite studies out of our lab looks at people's habits for eating popcorn when they're at the movies. You certainly don't go to the movies every day, but these are people for whom, when they go to the movies, they eat popcorn every time. And they have formed habits for that. And it's actually a great study. It basically shows they gave people fresh popcorn, one group of participants fresh popcorn, and another group of participants stale popcorn. And they showed that for those people who had strong habits to eat popcorn at the movies, they ate just as much stale popcorn as fresh popcorn. Isn't this great? Because once you've established strong habits, your goals are essentially irrelevant.
Bringing this back to you for a moment. So you've been studying habit. How are your personal habits? Do you have everything dialed in just so, or do you still have holes in your overall game plan?
Just because you know a lot about a habit does not mean that you have the self control to get to the point where you've successfully established your habits. So I find that once I can establish habits, I can generally maintain them. But there are a lot of times where even once you've established good habits, a change in context can break those habits. And so as a graduate student living in Los Angeles, you tend to move regularly because rent is expensive. And when you move, it's very disruptive to the habits that you've established because your cues change. So the places you would run change and the place that you had set up your kind of exercise situation changes, right? And you have more space or less space. And so I find that if I stay in one place for a long time, I generally have established some pretty good habits. But the second I move, I'm a big old mess.
Is there a single greatest lever that somebody can pull to kind of give themselves the maximum chance of success for whatever their New Year's resolution, if it's a habitual resolution?
Yeah, I think a couple things. One, I'd say, actually relating back to this context change issue, if you have a bad habit that you want to break, the best time to do it is not necessarily New Year's. Find a time where something in your life is changing, whether you're changing jobs or changing apartments or just have something big happening in your life, like you're having a baby. Those are all major periods of context change, and your cues will shift and utilize that time as a window of opportunity to change your behavior. Because when your cues change, when your context change and your cues change, you're able to kind of reflect on your values during that time and use that to change your behavior for the better. So utilize those naturally occurring context changes. If you don't have any naturally occurring context changes, that's okay. You can try to make some. So it's effortful to change your behavior, but you can try to cheat it in some certain ways. So, if, for example, from the popcorn study, one of my favorite things that they did was they ran a follow up where they had people hold the popcorn containers using a little handle. They had to hold it in their dominant hand. So they had to eat the popcorn with their non dominant hand. And people didn't eat the disgusting stale popcorn because it's not automatic to eat with your non dominant hand. So if you don't have a natural context change, think about ways that you can kind of artificially change kind of the automaticity of your behavior interacting with your environment. And one of those ways is just don't do things the way that you traditionally do them.
Smart Drug Smarts.
So thank you so very, very much to Dr. Jen Lebrecht for taking the time for that conversation. My initial belief was that it was an extremely timely conversation to have this talk about habit around the time of New Year's resolutions, etc., etc. It certainly is the traditional time to be thinking about establishing habits. But by far, my favorite single thing that we talked about in that conversation was your point that we can use the environmental changes that happen in our own life, just randomly, things that we don't necessarily have control over or think about, as these times when we can intentionally plant the seeds of new habit, because even though changes are tough, they do have the benefit of taking us away from the cues that we're normally used to. So it's a great time to look for new cues, make those into habit triggers, and start establishing some new habits that we'd like to have. So best of luck to you in whatever your New Year's resolutions might be. As for me in my 2016, well, that is the perfect lead-in to this week's Ruthless Listener Retention Gimmick.
Smart Drug Smarts. Ruthless listener retention gimmick.
So as I mentioned, I have one thing that I'm going to be really trying to do over the course of the next couple of weeks. Let's say by the 15th of January. Although if I'm startlingly successful, it could take less time. If I'm a little less so, it could take a little more time. But this is something that I'm looking to do, which will clear up some mental bandwidth. And by clearing up that bandwidth, hopefully, effectively, make me somewhat smarter. So I'm going to roll the Wayback Machine here all the way back to March of 2011 in the Journal of Experimental Social Psychology and read verbatim. Even after one stops actively pursuing a goal, many mental processes remain focused on the goal, potentially occupying limited attentional and working memory resources. 5 studies examined whether the processes associated with unfulfilled goals would interfere with tasks that require the executive function, which has a limited focal capacity and can pursue only one goal at a time. In studies 1 and 2, activating a goal non-consciously and then manipulating unfulfillment caused impairments on later tasks requiring fluid intelligence and impulse control. Study 3 showed that impairments were specific to executive functioning tasks. An unfulfilled goal impaired performance on logic problems, but not on a test of general knowledge. Only the former requires executive functions. Study 4 found that the effect was moderated by individual differences. Participants who reported a tendency to shift readily amongst their various pursuits showed no task interference. And finally, Study 5 found that returning to fulfill a previously frustrated goal eliminated the interference effect. These findings provide converging evidence that unfulfilled goals can interfere with later tasks insofar as they require executive functions. So what does all that mean? To break that way down, it sounds as if having half-fulfilled goals, like a project that you started but you didn't quite finish, that's still kind of lingering there and hasn't completely receded from your attention, they're like a small focus drain that's keeping you from shining the full power of your attention on whatever it is that you really are intending to currently be fully focusing on. The side point that they made that these negative effects were only found on things requiring executive functions is a good one. I mean, that's talking about skills like you might be able to ride a bicycle with no hands while carrying on a conversation about physics. And that's not a problem because riding the bicycle with no hands is something that you have habituated to the extent where it's not requiring any executive function. But most of the behaviors that we do that are related to our goals, our big wins, our things that we're really trying to achieve, those are exactly the ones that do require executive function. So we want to keep our executive function capabilities as uncluttered, unfettered as they possibly possibly can be. So to put this into practice, I'm doing a massive spring cleaning of essentially my computer hard drive and the various things where I keep to-do lists. I've got several different places across my life, some of them digital, some of them physical, some of them old closets and chests and drawers, that all to a certain extent are little bits and pieces of a to-do list, things that I intend to do, things some of which I've started but I haven't quite finished but I intend to come back to, and I'm going to try to just be ruthless, calling a spade if a project is something that's probably never going to get finished, and seeing if I can succeed in clearing up some bandwidth and getting a little bit more executive function out of that.
Just say no to scratch that. Say yes to the Smart Drug Smarts podcast. Join our mailing list at www.smartdrugsmarts.com.
Okay, you heard it. That is the entire episode, number 109, the first of 2016, coming in for a landing. Thank you so much for hanging around until the end. If you like this podcast, please make a habit of sharing it with your friends, family, people that you think might have something to gain by the kind of stuff that we talk about here. And of course, if you're feeling like going shamefully public in your love of Smart Drug Smarts, then we always appreciate a warm review on iTunes. The show notes for this episode will be online at smartdrugsmarts.com, including the links to everything that I talked about here. If you want to check out Dr. Jen Lebrec's work, we'll have a link to her website. Her last name is hard to spell, so the link provided will certainly be helpful. I'll be back at you next week, same time, same podcast, and with the same unflagging commitment to helping you fine-tune the performance of your own brain. Have a great first week of the new year. Best of luck on any New Year's resolutions that you are undertaking. And of course, stay smart.
You've been listening to the Smart Drug Smarts podcast. Visit us online at www.smartdrugsmarts.com and subscribe to our mailing list to keep your neurons buzzing with the latest in brain optimization. Smart Drug Smarts should be listened to for entertainment purposes only, although some guests on the show are medical doctors, most are not, and the host is just some random guy. Nothing you hear on this podcast or read at smartdrugsmarts.com should be considered medical advice. Consult your doctor and use some damn common sense before doing anything you think might have a lasting impact on your brain.